Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for being here after lunch. I'll try to be as dynamic as possible so no one falls asleep. So my name is Ben. I'm VP Product and Design at Blablacar, and as Pierre said, I've been there for more than 8 years, actually. I've seen a lot of stuff, and today I'm super excited to be here to share with you how we've learned a lot about product management and how we manage and do product management in our teams for the past 2 years, thanks to actually events that I would not wish to anyone in the room, because those were quite of roller coaster years. I'm going to tell you a lot about what crises tell about our product team, about how we do product, how we think about product, and all the changes we've been doing over the past 2 years and how we operate today as a product team. Before I start, I just want to take a step back and show you how the past 2 years have been at Blablacar, because when you think about COVID, you might think, OK, it was COVID, but I think we've been suffering and seeing a lot of different stuff. Actually, it all started in Feb 2020. So for those who remember, back then, there were the strikes in France. So you could not find any train. So what happened is that in our business, where we're offering a solution to travel, we had huge activity. Actually, people were actually moving to cars, or also to buses, as we offer Blablacar buses. So we had seen a huge growth in France, and we were seeing people not using Blablacar starting to use Blablacar. Actually, it was not only in France. We had seen the same growth in countries like Brazil, in countries like India, or in countries like Spain. And the result, if you look at the activity of Blablacar in 2020, is that we had kind of a great year. And actually, we were all looking at 2020 super excited, as it was the year we would probably do the best year we had ever done at Blablacar, and we're looking for that. So that was Feb 2020. Then, in March 2020, something happened. There was no more people on the road, as COVID just hit. Actually, we're in 22 countries. So actually, over the past 2 years, we've been saying that in all the countries we're in, at different times of the year. And the result for Blablacar is that if in March 2020 you would go on Blablacar, you would see that. No trip. So today, if you go on Blablacar and you look for a Paris to Rennes, you would see thousands of buses, hundreds of carpool, thousands of people traveling every day thanks to us. But back then, no more users. To an extent that we were also telling our users not to use Blablacar because of COVID. So if you think about that, you're building a product and you're telling your users, please don't use it. Seems a bit strange. That was how 2020 started. And then 2020, 2021, the activity started, stopped again, confinement, deconfinement. As I was saying, we're in 22 countries. So when France is being deconfined, Brazil is being confined. But at the same time, Italy is being deconfined, but not with the same rules. So kind of a mess over the past 2 years. Then 2022. It's getting better. We're all getting vaccinated. People start to traveling again. It's great. But we're in 2 countries, and big countries at Blablacar. One is Russia, the other one is Ukraine. And as you know, I won't tell you the whole story about that, but since months, Ukraine is in war, and so the activity there is highly affected because people can no longer travel. So that's the activity, but I just want also to show you those faces. Those people are Andrei, Irina, Oksana, Artem, Pavlo, and Artem. They are the people in our teams, in the product team, that work in Ukraine and that were based in Kyiv. So today, I'm here, we're speaking, but there are people that are fighting for their lives and actually trying to save what they can. And I'm glad to be here today to share what we've learned with them, but I also have a thought for them, because they are suffering, and we do not wish the same for everyone here. So those are the 2 years we've been, and I think that picture represents pretty easily what we've been seeing. Ups, down, ups, down. We learned a lot. Today, in most countries, we're almost back to the normal activity as it was before COVID. Even in some countries, it's better, thanks to all the changes we've done. And today, I want to share with you the 3 things we learned around how we do product management. The first one is accepting the unknowns. And it's all about the uncertainty that you have to see and you have to live with when you're in such a moment. The second one is around stick to your principles. It's all about knowing where you're heading to and how you have to adapt even if you have a plan. And finally, I'll talk about go deep on your basics, which is all about fixing and owning the basics of your product. So if you're still with me after lunch, now I'll zoom on the first one. Accept the unknowns, and don't try to predict the future. The first questions when such a moment happens is, when will things get back to normal? When will we be able, as a person, to go out when it was COVID, but also as product managers, when we'll be able to do tests again? Because when you have no users on the platform, like, you can't do any test. Or when can we restart a feature? That's the first question we ask ourselves. And the second is, what should we do? Like, should we keep on doing what we had planned, or should we start tweaking our product because the world is changing? When you had COVID, we were confined. Should we change the way it looks, change the way it works? We ask ourselves all those questions. But the key point is that there was a lot of ambiguity, because no one knew what the world would be. Actually, even governments didn't know what we had to do. So how do you do product management in those moments where there are a lot of unknowns and you don't know what the world is going to be? And I'll share with you actually 3 examples of stuff we've done, good and bad ones, in those moments, and what we learned from that. The first changes we've tried to do in our product during that time is around the feature. If you ever use Blablacar, you might know 2 max in the back. That's a feature that enables drivers to tell that the passengers will only be 2 at the back of the car. It's for convenience, comfort. It's a great feature that our users love. When COVID hit, and we were all confined, and the deconfinement was getting closer like a month and a half ahead, we asked ourselves, should we change our product to match the new reality that might come? We all sat together and we say, hey, instead of doing 2 max in the back, let's do only 1 in the back. People will value that because they will be separated, they will wear a mask, everyone will be happy to travel, respecting the social distances and all the sanitary procedures. We launched that, we worked on that, but the result was it didn't work. Actually, very few users use that, despite the circumstances. And even the ones that were using that actually at the moment stopped because they didn't see any value in it. Why? Because actually, we built something in a moment with so many unknowns, with so many assumptions, that actually we were wrong. So you could tell me, oh, but actually you suck at research, if you had done more research, ask your users what they feel and would they value that. But trying to do research in a moment where everything is so fuzzy, everything is unclear, there are a lot of unknowns, every learnings you'll get will be wrong because things will change so much. You ask people on a week, and the week after, they've changed their mind because things are changing. So build something on many assumptions, many ambiguity, and it was wrong. Nevertheless, we tried again. During COVID, we also did a hackathon. We called it COVID Fight, and we regrouped many people and thought about how can we help users with our product in the time of COVID. So people regrouped, we sent about a lot of ideas. One we came with was BlaBlaHelp. So you might have heard about it, but BlaBlaHelp was an app to help users to connect to each other about the grocery shopping. So for example, you would be afraid of going out, you could ask someone to pick up your groceries or to do it for you. It was a great idea that back then as well, during confinement, because you are all not knowing how to do groceries. But the issue is that, again, we're doing that with a lot of unknowns and a lot of ambiguity, like would the confinement last for months, quarters, years? How was deconfinement going to be? So we built that on a lot of assumptions, and the result was the same. Few people ended up using our product, and retention was low because people were just not looking for that at that moment. On the moment we built it, it made sense, but there was so many changes in the environment that it became not usable. However, we learned from those two, and when the Ukrainian war hit us, actually, we learned from those, and we did a second hackathon. And in this one, actually, we shared rules with the teams. We said, okay, there are so many unknowns, like when is the war going to stop? Is the war going actually to stabilize in the region? How is it going to be Ukraine? All of that we don't know. But what we know is that if we want to help our users, we can, but we need to set up rules that absorb and accept that ambiguity. The rules were pretty simple. You can only leverage existing tools. You can do only small changes, or you can build stuff outside of our product so that we can build stuff that accept that ambiguity. We did 3 things that actually worked pretty well. We changed the number of seats that people can offer on Blablacar. So if they were moving out of Ukraine to Poland, instead of having 3 passenger max, they could put 20. We removed all the fees for our passengers, or we launched a Telegram bot. So basically, we tweaked our product, accepting the ambiguity and doing only small changes that would make a difference, but not big ones that actually were based on a lot of assumptions. So if I go back to my first question, when will things get back to normal? They will never be. And the world is changing that much, and there are so many assumptions that trying to build something on those assumptions will end up in a failure. So my first message is, don't try to predict the future, slightly adapt if needed, but actually sometimes you just have to wait and just don't do stuff, instead of trying to react to everything that is happening. That's the first learning we had. The second one is on our principle, is on being clear on where we're heading to. Maybe, just as a reminder, we're a 100,000 people company, so when the COVID hit us, you don't have 10 engineers asking themselves what they should work on with one product manager. We have more than 300 people asking themselves what should we work on, because the world is changing. We were building something 3 months ago, we were building something for Ukraine. Does it still make sense? How do we do? The question is, what are our intangible principles? What's the plan we have, and what should we build our product on? If you don't have that plan, as actually we didn't have when the COVID hit us first, you have those quarterly roadmaps when you know what you're going to be working on next. But if everything you had planned over the next 3 months becomes completely irrelevant, what's next? If you don't have the plan, if you don't have those principles you want your product to be built on, it's kind of a hard hit to take. So after COVID, actually, we worked a lot on defining what are the dimensions, what are the principles that we want to work on as a company. Here you can see the 9 we've defined, which are actually the areas of our product and where we want to go, where we build our product. For example, we want to make sure the passenger experience is as great as possible. We want to comply with regulations. Those are the principles and the areas of our product. On each of those, we've built a very clear plan around what are the blocks that we want to do. And so each is very defined, and we work on a roadmap, a yearly roadmap actually, in which we clearly define for each of those principles what we want to work on and what we don't want to work on. Thanks to that, every team is very clear on, and we build that with the teams. Every team is very clear on what they should work on next. So if at some point you have a change, like the war in Ukraine, you can adapt because you know what's coming next. You know what should you not work on. And that helps people getting a directions and not being completely disturbed by those changes of our environment. That roadmap we do is shared with the whole company, and everyone has access to it. So we also know that when things change, people can refer to that document. But that's very practical, and that's very a theory of a 1-year-long roadmap. But how do we keep those principles and adapt our path when things hit? Because in 2022, we had done that exercise of having a long-term roadmap, but then the Ukrainian war hit us. So then you have to change the path towards that new direction. And the path we've taken and we suggested to teams were different. For example, as I said earlier, having unknowns is also accepting uncertainty. So for example, we told teams, you have a plan, but plan a bit shorter. Because if you try to be long-term and things change a lot, if there is a lot of uncertainty, don't bother trying to build long-term plans. Because what you know on Jan 1st might be wrong on Feb 1st. So if you try to build longer-term plans, they will be wrong. They will always be focused on your principles, but the plan might adapt. The other path we took is actually also to ask teams to finish first. It might seem obvious what I'm telling, but I'm sure that in every of the product person in the room here, you have a project in mind, one that is close to the end, almost done, but you've already shifted to the next one because it's so tempting to do that. In those moments when uncertainty hits you, focus on finishing the stuff you've opened, because otherwise, you never know what's going to be the future. Again, a lot of ambiguity. So it's important to finish this kind of stuff. And the third one is around the path to easier with less traffic. as I've told you, we had no more traffic on Blablacar. That's a problem, but that can also be an opportunity. Indeed, you can't do an A/B test, but you'll also have less people complaining to customer support if you fuck up. Or you can do bigger changes because you'll have less transition to do. So that is also an opportunity for teams on what they want to do to potentially be bolder or to move faster on what they had planned, because the constraints they had is removed. So the stick-to-one principle is all about that. Being clear on where you want to go, and that's all the exercise we've done, having a yearly roadmap and being very clear about what we want to do, but also be agile and be ready to adapt if needed, because you have that plan. The plan is sure to help you react pretty quickly, rather than not knowing that. Sometimes people call agility the way of having, quarterly roadmaps and asking ourselves every time what should come next. We truly believe that actually agility is about reacting to those changes, having a plan and being very quick at reacting when those changes hit, because you have the plan and because you have those principles. The last learning I want to share with you is go deep on your basics. As I shared with you, we had principles like dimensions we want to work on and on which we have a very clear vision. But when we look at those and when you look in the detail of those, we found out that there were actually two types of dimensions, two types of features that were blocking us from being very great on those principles. The first one, and I'm pretty sure you have a lot of features like that in mind, are that's the way it is features. The kind of features where when you ask someone in the company, why are we doing that this way, people tell you to talk to the guy that was here before. I've been at Blablacar for 8 years, so people come a lot to me, asking me, why are we doing that? And my answer is actually, I don't have that much people to turn to. But that's the kind of stuff that are here for quite a long time. And I'll show you an example of one of those at Blablacar. If you look at the screen here, that's our search results. Actually, there were search results a few months ago. If you look for the bus ride that leaves from Orléans to Angers, the duration of that trip, it's probably going to take you 25 to 30 seconds to compute that it's actually, I don't even remember. So we don't display durations on Blablacar. Why don't we display durations on Blablacar? No one knows. We've done it for reasons. But if we look at our principles on the slides, which is offered the best-in-class booking experience, if you look at any other website in travel, they do display duration. So why the hell don't we display duration? Why should we change, actually? There is no reason. Actually, being very clear on our principles and knowing where we want to go forced us to look at the core of our product and do changes that are very important to do. So now on Blablacar, you can find durations. That's pretty easy, that's pretty simple. But being very clear on what is our principle and what we want to do and what's the core forced us to look at those basics that we don't do and that we need to fix. So there is that's the way it is, but there is also it's used to be this way. The features you built 3, 4, 5 years ago that were built in a specific time moment with some assumptions or some reality, but actually might not be longer valid. That's the kind of the frog in hot water analogy. You've built those, the environment is changing, you're not seeing that, and one day, I hope you won't, but you end up as the frog just die in the hot water. And I'll show you an example of that at Blablacar. If you ever use Blablacar, you might know the automatic accept feature. As a driver, you offer a ride, and you either accept to get bookings automatically, or you want to validate those bookings. So if you use any marketplace, for example, as Airbnb, that's the instant booking of Airbnb. That's a feature that our drivers actually value a lot, and passengers as well. When we look at our numbers, so in orange, you can see the number of drivers offering automatic. So not that much, but still an important share. And our principle on carpool is that we want to fill up all the rides. So obviously, a driver that is an automatic has more chances to fill up his car. When we define that principle, actually, it forces us also ourselves to look at those numbers and look at those features that have been here for a long time to look if they are still valid. And actually, when we look at this one, what we notice is that if we look at it on a yearly basis, it's kind of stable. But if you look at it on a longer time span, actually it's decreasing. Why? Because we've built that a few years ago with some assumptions that actually were right at that time. But the world is changing, the things are evolving. And it's important that you own those core features, that you own those principles, and make sure that you keep on looking at those key features and see if they are still valid. So here, the learning is, why should it remain this way? Actually, there is no reason. We probably need to change the way it works, because the world is changing, the world is evolving. The result of that, I don't have it, because the teams are working on that, but it's exactly the kind of topic where we're looking back and seeing that the world has changed, and so we need to adapt how it looks like. So the learning here is you have to be perfect on your principles, those core features in your product to unleash the potential and to make sure you reach your ambition. Because those are the kind of things that if you don't do, you can keep on adding innovation. But if the basics are not solid, the whole thing will collapse. And during crises, when you don't have data, when everything changes, being very clear on those is important. And it's also the moment when you take a step back and look at those. So the were the 3 learnings I wanted to share with you. How do you accept the unknowns? And how do you accept that ambiguity is there and you don't try to predict the future and just sometimes wait for things to be clearer and not react fastly? How do you stick to your principles? How do you are being very clear on where you want to go, what's your plan, even if it can evolve, but having a plan helps you to accept the ambiguity because you know what's going to come next. And within those principles, within that, how do you make sure you're perfect on the basics? Because that's why people use your product, and if you're not good at that, at some point, as the frog, things might collapse. That's all I wanted to share with you today. Thanks a lot for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. Very interesting. So you learned many lessons the hard way. You had to go through crisis, war, and disease. How can people in the audience get the same epiphany, the same lessons without all this crisis?
So first, I don't wish anyone to have this crisis to live. That was a tough time, but one we learned a lot. I think it's about also taking a step back and looking at how your product is doing and how your team is doing. So sometimes I'm not saying about forcing your crisis and just shut down your product to see how it works. It's rather like sometimes just taking the time to step back and look at what's happening. Okay.
The audience wants to know, how did you adapt your organization and management to face this crisis / remote?
So I think there is 2 dimensions in my answer. So one is remote. I won't zoom that much into that one because I think all companies have been forced to do remote. Some were more adapted to that, and all of us we've adapted. And I think in terms of organization, as a company, we first put people first, actually. So making sure that people are aware, in the for example, in the Ukrainian war, our first focus was to help people from Ukraine to be in safe places. During COVID, that was making sure that people with children were aware that we knew they had children and therefore they couldn't work. So adapting the way we look at people. And therefore, for example, accepting that our bandwidth as a team is no longer 100%. It might be 50 or 75%. So we not adapted the way our organization works, but we've adapted and we shared the message with everyone that it's such a different time that it should be a different perception of people time and availability.
Thank you very much. Another question. How has the way people are using your product in Ukraine impacted your company culture and the stress levels of your employees?
That's a good one. I think as a company, as I said before, we really put people first. So we work a lot on helping people in Ukraine to move out of Ukraine, and we've been very clear and very transparent about those people's situations. So it has not that much adapted the culture in a way that it was the culture already that we had seen with COVID, or people first. So it was like, it was normal for people to do so. And as one of the person that's been at Blablacar for quite some time, it felt normal to me that the company would behave this way. So it has not changed. We're like, our culture is about that, and therefore we apply that culture.
Perhaps because your culture was already aligned with what
exactly.
was about to happen. Accept the present means roadmap without any dates.
That's a good question. I don't think it means that. I think it rather means that we should have dates, because I think otherwise you'll always, things will take time. It's rather kind of sometimes as leadership, living with that schizophrenia of pushing people to plan and to have dates, but being ready to change if things happen, but knowing when to pull the trigger. I think the worst thing that could happen is no dates and changing every time. Here it's, as I said, like having principles. So at the end, the direction is the same. We want to go at the same place. The path can be different, but we want to go at the same place. That means having dates and stuff like that. So we push for dates, but as leadership, we need to be ready to change those when those moments hit.
Very clear. Are accessibility and inclusivity part of Blablacar's intangible principles? If yes, how do you plan to include it?
So that's a good one. I think we've been working a lot on inclusivity and all of that at Blablacar. I won't detail everything around our culture, but that's really core to our culture as a company. Within our product, we don't do that much, I'll be honest. It's something we know we have to work on. Our accessibility, we do work on that, but we could do more indeed. But we first focus on the company culture. As I said, people is really at the center of the culture of the company, and therefore the efforts have been put on that part.
Another question is one of your, let's say, principle, at least conclusion was go deep on your basics. How can you make it happen in the company without what you experienced, especially when you are asked for always more features?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That's a tough moment, the crisis helped us to do that in a way for us. Like we had to step back because we had no users. I think when you're being asked to do new features, that probably means that as product, you don't share that much about what you've built already. And I tie that to ownership. Like if you've done a feature and you've been asked to do a new one, if you are the owner of the first one, that means you should, communicate about its performances, its impact, and you should be pushing for that. And usually what I've seen is that if you don't own the features, and actually that's what happened to us, the two stuff I showed you, there was no ownership. So in a way, no one was able to tell, hey, we need to change. If you have ownership and you are recognized as the person to own, and you communicate about that, then that starts to change the message. And in a way, communication is all about repetition. So if you're the owner and keep on sharing, we need to invest on that part, and it's very clear, that will help. And I could share more about that, but there are many stuff on which we knew as a product team we had to invest. It was not a new feature, it was potentially changing stuff. And it's because we communicate on that very clearly to multiple people multiple times that actually we changed the mind of people. There is no like silver bullet on how you change people's mind. It's more like repetition all along.
At some point in your speech, you said we had something like 300 engineers to feed with tickets or whatever. So you had all your crises, but isn't it the same at a smaller extent for a product manager with his 5 engineers in his product team? Doesn't he experience the same, like I need to feel all these devs, which prevent him from going deep on his basics?
Yeah, I think I connect that to the principles in the sense that if that's very clear for your team, that will create ownership not only for you as a product managers, but for the engineers. And therefore, there will be actors of that. In a team, for example, if I take the search team in our company that handles the search, even if the project they're working on gets stopped for any reason, there is a principle that they want to offer the best search experience. So they're always like benchmarking and thinking about new stuff. So if that stops, the engineers are part of that thinking of what could we do next to improve our experience. So I would connect that to your principle. Actually, your basics and go deep are based on your principle. So if you know what you're for, And if you have a mission and if you know where you're heading to, that's going to make you not alone as a product manager, but you're going to be as a team.
And how do you know when you went far enough, deep enough on your basics? Because it can be endless.
Yeah, that's a good one. I connect that to probably metrics in a way. So in all of those principles and those teams, we have metrics we want to optimize for, and that can be conversions or this kind of business metrics, but also NPS. That's something we look at even more today than we used to do before COVID, knowing how people feel about our product. So we say we want to offer the best experience. Best can be better conversion, but it can be also best feeling. And looking at those two metrics is a way to tell us, okay, we're good now.
How did you manage the relationships between your Ukrainian and Russian employees?
Yeah, so actually now the Russian entity is one on which we no longer invest, so that's a different team. So actually they used to be working together, but now it's really Russian is a separate entity.
How do you convince a leadership to accept the unknowns when they want to always better predict things? And that they need to set roadmaps to investors or things like that?
I think it goes back to me, the accepting the unknowns, and my message is about not trying to do new stuff because the world is changing. So you have the principles on which your leadership is invested, on which your board of investors is into. That's the plan. The accept the unknowns is about not trying to do stuff on the side because you want to react to a change. And if that change doesn't match your principle, then I think that's where you can convince your leadership, which is, hey, we want to go this way, but what we might be trying to do goes in a different direction. Does it make sense? Probably not. Or if you believe as a leadership it makes sense, then we need to have another conversation, which is about that maybe our principles are not clear, and we need a new one. And that's something that helps a lot, shaping the discussion with the leadership around that's where we want to go. Everything that doesn't fit into that plan, it triggers questions.
And perhaps to end this session, two last questions, perhaps, and they are linked. So, how did you come up with your principles?
Mm-hmm.
Did they evolve? And finally, to what extent are they used when you prioritize? How do you include them in your prioritization framework or whatever you use?
Yeah. So I'll answer to the second one on prioritization. So we try to map our teams, both product engineering, according to those principles. But that actually we have, easier prioritization and trade-off discussions, because when we talk about, the carpool experience, that's a team and that's easier. So it's within that principle we can prioritize rather than shall we work on, carpool or shall we work on compliance? That's like, the unsolvable problem. So we try to separate the resources so that we can have this easy conversation. And I think I forgot your first part.
How did you come up with your principles and did they evolve?
Yeah, so they've not evolved that. We've come up with those last year, so they've not evolved, and I hope they won't evolve that much. It's more we ask ourselves, if our vision is to be the go-to platform for shared travel, what does it mean and what does it take to get there? And therefore, we look at the path and the dimensions, and we try to come up with a limited list, because otherwise the list can be long. But yeah, that's what are the big blocks to go to our vision, and that's how we came up with those.
Okay, last one. You've been at Blablacar for 8 years, which in the tech world is a kind of a record. What keeps you excited, motivated every day to go to Blablacar?
I would say three things. The first one is the people. Some questions were related to that. I think it's the culture of Blablacar is about people, and I've been working with great and very smart people, and that's what makes me come at work every day, being challenged and working with those people. The second one is the project. So if you look at Blablacar, we're doing carpool and buses. Tomorrow we want to sell trains in France on Blablacar. So keeps on, innovating and pushing the limits of what transport is online. And the third one, and I had an interesting chat with someone just before the talk, is keep on learning. I think when you stay, and that's my belief, and happy to debate afterwards, but if you stay, I think you stay in company, it's about cycle. Usually it lasts like 2 to 3 years. You've been working as a product manager for 2 or 3 years in a company, and at the end of those, you feel like you've seen everything. Actually not, you've seen everything, but now you're doing the same round, but a bit farther, and you see stuff a bit differently, and again and again. I think that what keeps me awake is the way I see Blablacar business and Blablacar product today is like super far away from how I was seeing the business and the product 2 years ago, and even 4 years ago. And I'm pretty sure if I stay 2 years more, and I hope so, I'll be seeing the stuff differently. So that's always, that excitement of seeing the stuff you don't know, the curiosity of how the stuff is, because a product is so complex, and a company actually is, any company is so complex, and there are so many stuff to discover that staying long creates more opportunity to learn and to see new stuff. So yeah, the people, the learning, and the project.